So I'm happy with my form behavior here, or with the behavior of this input, but there's one thing which we must not forget. This is one input of an overall form, and in this case, of course, it's the only input. But often you would have more than one input, as we're also soon going to see in the basic form JavaScript file. And for such scenarios, of course, it would be good if we also could find out if the overall form is valid. In the one input case, the overall form is always valid if the one input is valid. But if it's a form with multiple inputs, that's of course not the case. Then 3 of 4 inputs might be valid, 1 input might be invalid, and the overall form then also would be invalid. Because the overall form is only valid if all form inputs are valid. And as soon as at least one form input is invalid, the overall form is invalid. And that's therefore something we should take into account and also incorporate into our logic. But how can we do that now? Well, here's one way of doing that. We can add a new state, which is form is valid, and it has a set form is valid state updating function. And initially that's false, because initially that form isn't valid. Now I want to update this overall form is valid updating function whenever one of the form inputs changes. And for that we could again use useEffect. So I'll bring back that import, and I'll then add a useEffect call here below those two constants here. And in this useEffect call here, I want to set the overall form validity. For this, I'm interested in the validity of my form inputs, and hence I'll add all the form input validities I have in this form here. So for example, the entered name is valid, constant. If we had 2 form inputs here, we would have another constant. For example, for the entered age is valid. And then I would enter entered age as is valid as another dependency here. But we don't have that here, hence it's only one entry. Now that's the dependency of useEffect, and as you learned, whenever the value in such a dependency changes, this effect runs again. And it also runs for the very first time this component is evaluated. So in this useEffect call, I then basically want to combine all my dependencies and check if they are all valid, and if they are, I want to set the overall form to valid. So here I'll check if entered name is valid, and I would add other validities if we had them, like entered age is valid, and check if that's true as well, but we don't have that here. And if it is valid, then I'll set my overall form as valid. Else, if at least one of my inputs is invalid, I'll set my overall form to invalid. So I'll set form is valid to false. And then we could use this value as well. For example, if we wanted to disable this button. Here we could set disabled equal to not form is valid. So the button is disabled if the form is not valid. Now for this, I'll quickly add a style for this. So on the button here, I'll just set a disabled style, which also should apply if the button is then hovered or set as active. And I'll simply add a background color of a light gray here, and a text color of a slightly darker gray, like this, and a border color of that light gray as well. And I'll set the cursor to not allowed. But that's just some CSS styling for this. With that added though, and with disabled being set, you see this button is disabled at the start. It also stays disabled, but if I enter at least one valid character, it becomes enabled. If I invalidate again, it's now disabled again. Now also the form can't even be submitted anymore if it's invalid. Now it's up to you whether you want to disable the button or not. You'll find opinions in both directions out there in the web. There are also people which argue that you should allow your users to submit an invalid form, to not restrict them without them knowing what they have to enter, but that is up to you. I just want to show you how you could build something like this and how you could manage the overall form validity in addition to the validity of the individual inputs, because that can also matter. Of course, if we take a closer look at this useEffect function here, though, we don't even need useEffect. We're not performing any side effect in there. We're doing nothing that would be a problem if we would do it without using useEffect. All we're doing is deriving a new value, just as we're already doing it in lines 7 and 8 with entered name is valid and name input is invalid. So we're basically doing the same here, just for deriving the overall form validity. And of course, there is no reason to use useEffect here for that. We can, but it really doesn't add anything, it just adds extra component re-evaluation cycles. And that's of course not an advantage. Instead, we can get rid of that form is valid state, and we can get rid of useEffect, and just check if entered name is valid, and any other properties we might have here, like an entered age if we had that. And then we simply add a new variable here, form is valid, which by default is false, let's say, which we then set to true here in this if case, and which we set to false here in the else case. And actually, we don't even need the else case now, because that is our default. And we only override this with true if all our input states are valid. So this again allows us to slim this down even further. And I'm showing this because thinking about possibilities like this is also worth it and is a good thing to do, because it allows you to write slimmer code and maybe even more performant code. So with that, we still got the same behavior as before, but now with less code.